Hello, I'm Emma Desi, and welcome to another episode of Turning Readers into Writers. If you're brand new here, welcome, and here's what you need to know. This is a community that believes you are never too old to write your first novel. No matter what you've been up to until now, if you're ready to write your book, I'm ready to help you reach the end. I focus on helping you find the time and confidence to begin your writing journey, as well as the craft and skills you need to finish the book. Each week I interview debut authors, editors and industry experts to keep you motivated, inspired and educated on all things writing, editing and publishing. If you want to catch up, head on over to emmadesi.com, where you'll find a wealth of information and tools to help you get started. Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 Top Tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode. Kate Cumiskey is a writer, painter and social justice activist in coastal Florida. Her work appears regularly in fine literary and peer-reviewed journals. Cumiskey and her husband Michael work together to meet the needs of homeless teenagers and young adults by housing them and promoting public awareness, including founding an independent student cadre at a local high school. She is recognised by the State of Florida Department of Education as a distinguished educator through the Best and Brightest Scholarship Programme and as a pioneering autism advocate by the National Association of Social Workers. So I talked to Kate more about how she came to be a poet, to be a novelist, her journey towards both of those. And she shares about her work, she shares about working with small presses, and she has lots of great advice for anybody who wants to develop their own poetry practice, and even has some writing prompts for us. So let's get chatting to Kate. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm excited.
Yes, me too. I'm really keen to delve into learning more about you and poetry in particular, because I'm not a poet, so I often find it quite mysterious. So I'm eager to learn more. But I wonder if you could just start by telling us about your journey to writing, both fiction and poetry.
Wow. I'm 58, so it's been a long journey. Actually, when I found out I was a writer, I was in high school. My husband and I were dating. We've been together 39 years now. And he said to me, "You speak like a poet. Why don't you start writing things down?" And I did. And that's when I realized I was a writer, which is kind of interesting. So I've been writing forever, but back in the day in the US, women in high schools were encouraged to go into one of three professions: nursing, teaching, or secretarial. I'm that old. So it never occurred to me to do anything else. And I became a special education teacher. And I did that for 20 years before I started getting very, very serious about my writing. And so I have a bachelor's in special education from the University of Florida. And then I started working here locally. I'm in Central Florida, and we have some incredible colonies, writing colonies. And I went to Atlantic Center for the Arts and worked for 3 weeks in an intensive with a poet named Robert Creeley, one of the beat poets. And it just changed my life. So I would say poetry community had so much to do with me getting serious about my writing. And following that experience, I went ahead and applied to get into a Master of Fine Arts program, or several. And I chose University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And it was a 3-year studio academic program. And I chose to stretch it into 4 years just to take advantage of being in that community. And I did a lot of nonfiction writing there. I did not start fiction until 7 years ago when I was experiencing some insomnia. And I didn't want to wake the house with doing research, like for my nonfiction, walking around, looking things up, that kind of thing. And I just started writing a story in the middle of the night. And that book, Anna, a social justice novel about homelessness, which I've long been involved in serving homeless youth, my husband and I. And I started writing that novel, and it is coming out with my publisher next year. They just invited me to send it to them, and my current publisher.
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Does that answer your question a little bit?
Oh, yes, definitely. And congratulations on your upcoming release. That's super, super exciting. And how nice to be asked.
It is nice. This publisher in particular, this is my 4th publisher, so this will be my 4th and 5th books. I'm finding them excellent to work with, and I believe what they are trying to keep their poets, their writers, because they do publish fiction as well. They try to keep their writers in-house if they have other manuscripts to offer.
Well, we'll come back to that a bit later, because I do want to ask you more about that. But just sticking with your poetry for now, as I mentioned, I'm not a poet naturally. It's not what I gravitate towards. And I wonder how you create your poetry, because I've heard lovely stories from some other poets about how, it's like often the muse hits them, and then, there's this flash, and they just have to sit down and be a vessel for the words. But then I've heard from other writers that it's a lot more protracted than that. So I wondered what your experience was, or is, rather.
Mine is kind of a hybrid. It's a little bit of both. I would say that writing poetry for me is grueling work. The poetry is work. The prose is not. The prose is pleasure, which has been an interesting journey for me to discover that. I do sometimes wake up, go to the computer or to the page, the poem comes out, it's there organically. It's sort of, you can't help it. I definitely can't help writing poems myself. And then I might take 5 to 7 years of revision on a given poem. So I am a big reviser. It does come out, but it doesn't come out finished for me. I revise. There's that. But lately, in my journey of learning about my own writing, I have started doing some prompt-driven poetry. And, which might be helpful to people for whom poetry does not come naturally. It's helpful for me. I will decide what to write about and then work on a poem. And I've been enjoying that a lot.
So that's quite a different, that's coming at it from a very different way. It sounds like previously or often
and
the poem hits you and then
feedback about my poetry. It's based on what people have said about my poetry. I'll think, they're saying I'm a Florida poet. I write about nature. Why don't I write about something in Florida in nature that interests me? And that's how I'm doing it. I'm basing it on feedback about my work.
Okay. Well, because I was going to ask you that actually. Are there any particular themes or recurring subjects that you find that you write about more often than
Apparently,
not?
Yes. I think I've been listening more to my the people who have been reviewing my current poetry book that's coming out from Finishing Line. And it's interesting. I learn about my work from the words of others who look at my work. And yes, I would say social justice, the environment in Florida, and sort of, thank you, dear, the love-hate relationship with Florida that many Floridians have, which I definitely share. I came here at 3 years old from Alabama with a space program. My dad was a rocket scientist with NASA. And I definitely write about Florida. I write a lot about the space program. I'm very, very interested in science, very interested in the evolution of space exploration. man's relationship with nature and with science as well. So those are definitely.
Mm-hmm. And so another question I was keen to ask you was, I think a lot of people, and maybe this comes from our education at school, but I think a lot of people have fear around poetry, and it feels a very difficult, complex medium to grasp. What are some of the fears that you've seen people have about writing poetry?
Well, I've experienced that a lot as a teacher of senior English. What we here in the States, the last year of high school, I taught seniors, and I did see a lot of fear. So what I've done with that, as far as to help take away that fear, because poetry can be daunting. I think the main fear is thinking you have to understand and decipher poetry rather than just experience it. And I think it's okay to just experience a poem. And I use short poems that are very physical, easy to understand, to kind of get people to enjoy poems. I think of William Carlos Williams. There's a poem of his, "This is just to say," and I may not quote it exactly, but "This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that you were probably saving for breakfast. I'm sorry they were so good and so cold." That's not an exact quote. I don't have it in front of me, but what a wonderful poem. And to teach students and young adults that I've taught, you can just take a poem from almost anything. An apology note on the refrigerator. That's what that poem was. And it's a very, very famous poem. And I also think it's fun to take prose if you're a little daunted by poetry, try to pull a poem out of a prose piece. That's a lot of fun. And it's called a found poem. You just put a disclaimer. I took this from, the Encyclopedia Britannica definition of, or article on Henry VIII. And you pull a poem out of there. And that can be fun. So those kind of prompt-driven things can take away the fear.
Mm-hmm. Oh, nice tip there. I've not heard of that before. A found poem. I'll be looking that one up.
I love found poems because if something appeals to my ear, and I had to be taught in graduate school to refer to myself as a writer rather than just a poet, because I really am a poet. I mean, that's, like I said, I don't have a choice about writing. But my ear, some things just lyrically appeal. And I'll give you an example. My husband and I were driving down the road, and there are a lot of buildings that are empty here now. And there was an old bank. And he said to me, that bank just wants a steeple and some Jesus. It wants to be a church. Well, the lyric of that line, a steeple and some Jesus, there's lyric everywhere. So just grabbing some lyric, and if you're daunted by poetry, grabbing it off of a page.
It sounds like some of your inspiration, some of your poetry has been rubbing off on your husband as well. It was very lyrical.
He's a musician, yes.
Ah, there we go.
Right.
Creative family. And so your poetry, traditionally your poetry, is it rhyming poetry, or is it more, I don't know what it's called, unrhyming, non-rhyming poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's an interesting question because, again, for me, it's more an organic process of discovering what my poetry is. And I have found that there's a lot of internal rhyme in my poetry. I don't generally end a line on a rhyme, okay. like say a sonnet. Mm-hmm. I don't do that, but there is a lot of rhyme in my poetry. I've had a lot of trouble in the past structurally with my work, where to end lines. That's something I've worked very hard on, and begin the next line and break up into stanzas and verses. So what I've done, it sounds crazy, but I have worked on sculpture. And when I work with my hands, it helps me know how to physically work with my poetry. When I'm doing something with sculpture, I can go back to the page, and it's somehow easier for me to physically break the lines correctly.
That's so interesting. I would never.
It has been great for me. It helped I needed a solution to where do I break these lines? And the sculpture is terrible, but it does help me with my poetry, working with my hands.
So that's so interesting. I don't know if it's just an intuitive thing, or are you able to explain a little bit more about how those two relate?
When I work with my hands on sculpture, it helps me to think of the poem as a physical thing. And then I can look at the lines and see, oh, move this here, rather than just the mystery of, oh gosh, where do I stop this line? And it has helped a lot.
Gosh, that's amazing, putting those two together.
It's a little weird, isn't it? Is it a little odd?
I don't like to say that, because I just think it just shows the magic of creativity and how our minds can work in such weird and wonderful ways, that if it makes a connection for you, then it's, I don't like to say that it's odd, but I've not heard of it before. That's true.
Well, as an educator too, I will say I'm a special education teacher by trade. And one of the things we have learned about learning with children is that when you physically engage with learning, when you use your body to learn, it's more, it's retained longer. Mm-hmm. So if you're teaching reading by, physically touching the letters, moving the book around, then you're keeping that. So I think that's probably what made me think of, knowing that about the learning process made me think of getting physical. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To help me.
Yeah, I've certainly heard of other people take up drawing or take up another art form just to break some writer's block, just to think differently. Right. But so maybe it's kind of an extension of that, or a part and parcel of breaking that kind of block about the end of lines.
But it helped me. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was going to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But,
Right.
So that's interesting that the ends of lines you found hard. Is there sort of in the teaching of poetry, is there a received way of doing it? Is there an expected way of ending a line, of moving to the next line?
There is. That's a great question. And it doesn't work that well for me. But for most people, I think it does, who are learning to write poetry. And that is ending a line where you pause to breathe.
Oh, nice.
So where you pause for a breath, that helps a lot of people. Also, I have found that the more difficult and compact a poem, the shorter my lines need to be. Maybe because you need that space, that white space, that space to breathe, that space to pause. And I have been told I write difficult, heavy poems. I don't write light verse, hardly ever. I'd like to, but I'm not good at that. And so my poems do tend to be fairly compact. One thing I'd like to mention, I kind of teach this. This is from my own brain. I don't know. But if I think of writing as soup, I think of prose as a nice, hearty soup. And I think of poetry as bouillon. I mean, poetry is just the nugget that is almost unpalatable sometimes. Ooh. That it needs. It's difficult. At least that's how poetry is for me. It's the absolute essential language. Whereas I think with prose, there's more room for play. There's more room for creativity for me, at least when I write. It's more fun. More help.
Interesting. Yeah. So if someone is, you've given us a lovely prompt there about doing the found poetry. If someone's a real beginner, is there any kind of way that they can find another way of finding an in? I'd love to have just a couple of tips for anybody.
I'll give you something I do to help students. I come into class, and I actually do this when I teach poetry. I do this as a rule now because I've found it so effective. I will take a piece of fruit, like an orange, or in Florida, I use oranges a lot. And the closer to rotten, the better. Not quite rotten, but very ripe. And I'll put it in the middle of the table on a plate and slice it, kind of smash it. And then I'll just have the students write adjectives about the orange. And we'll work on a poem from there. I think getting outside of yourself is easier. If you're going to write a poem about love or your parents, it's much harder, or your lover, or a death or a loss. That's harder. So writing something that's physical, in the room, contained, outside of yourself, I think it's much easier. And then so you get that list of adjectives, and then you just start filling in, the smells, the way it feels, touch the orange, things like that. And then you work together to kind of fill in.
That's such a great way. Yeah, no, that's a great way of seeing it, that if it's less you can almost be more objective, and then it's easier to kind of find a way in, rather than go straight into the hard stuff, to the very complex. And you'd be
amazed
stuff.
What comes out. You might enter into the hard stuff through that orange.
Yes. Oh, that's a great tip. Thank you for that one. Yeah. Now I'm going to move us on a little bit, because you mentioned earlier that you're working with a press.
Yes.
Am I right in remembering it's finishing line press?
Right.
And you've said that you really enjoy working with them, but they're the fourth press that you've worked with. So for those of us, because most of my listeners are new to the writing world, and I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how you might find a press to work with, that it's not, because I think a lot of us think once you get the agent, once you get the publisher, it's a done deal, it's really easy. But I imagine it's more complex than that, because you've got relationships there and deadlines to meet and expectations to live up to. So I'd be really interested to know about your experiences working with small presses.
Okay. When I was in I did not know in following graduate school, I knew I was a serious writer. I knew I wanted to write, but I didn't know how to publish. And I'm much more comfortable just pulling myself into a hole and writing. But for me, writing is reaching out and communicating. So I did want someone to read my work. I wanted people to be able to access my writing so that I could have that communication and writing. And I got a tip in graduate school in a class on publishing that what you should do to enter the publishing world, and I found this so useful, is think of something that nobody else knows. And I entered with nonfiction because in nonfiction, you need an idea and a book proposal, and then you get the contract, and then you write the book. So what I did was, you think of what you know, you find a publisher, and I'll talk about that in a second. You make a proposal and you get a book. Well, I did this with this very, enter into publishing perspective. I wasn't trying to be literary. And I know surfing. I grew up in a surfing town, island in Florida. I have 4 surfing sons, surfing husband. I know surfing very well. And actually, in the process of writing the book, I found that the town that I am from has the largest number of world-ranked surfers come from this town than anywhere on the planet, which really helped the book. I mean, Hawaii, South Africa, my town is the place to grow up if you want to be a world-class surfer. So I knew I made a proposal to a trade house. I had a contract in 3 days. No one had written about surfing in New Smyrna Beach ever. And then it took me 3 years to write the book, and it was difficult. But it did give me that first book. And that book's been very good to me. I would not work with a publisher again. I'm not going to say who it is because the process was good, but the royalties have been, for instance, they tell me it doesn't sell, but it sells all over town all the time. So they haven't given me a second book run royalty. So I'm like, I'm not going to work with them again, because that is somewhere publishers can, they can lie to you. But I had that first book, did a second book with a wonderful poetry house. Many poetry houses are very small. My second book was poetry, and the press, which I love, is Silent E Publishing out of Jacksonville, Florida. They do some vanity work, some self-publishing, but we're trying to enter into traditional publishing with my book. So I got a traditional contract with them. I do traditional publishing rather than self-publishing. Maybe a little bit out of insecurity. I need that validation from the canon, I guess. But I think a lot of people can do much better self-publishing. The money is better, I just don't do it. Plus I'm lazy. I don't, as far as the physical work of a book, I mean, putting a book together and publishing it myself, I don't think I'd have that discipline or that knowledge base. So I'd rather concentrate on the writing and get a little less money. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. No, it absolutely does. I certainly find, depending on what's going on in my life, I have less time for the writing, and because I'm doing more of the other stuff. So it's a constant juggling act. Yes.
Right. I'd rather limit myself and just work with good houses. So Silent E was great. And then I went with another trade book because I was teaching at the University of Central Florida. And I found the university very interesting. I had access to the archives, so I wrote a history of that. And I did the same thing with the nonfiction proposal. I wrote a proposal, had a contract right away. And then my poetry manuscript now is coming out with finishing line. They're wonderful. I would say with poems, specifically with publishing poems, there are some fabulous resources out there for finding the right home for your individual poems. And traditional poetry publishers do prefer that several of the poems in the manuscript have appeared in magazines and publications before they will accept your manuscript. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good stepping stone too. And submittable.com is fabulous for finding the right place for your work, for poems, for prose, nonfiction, fiction, pieces. It's a free website. It's fabulous. So I use Submittable, and I do have a little trick. I like to sort by deadline and submit when the deadline is close because you get your answer. So like I would go in and do a Submittable sort for a poem that I think is finished and ready to be out in the world. And I will sort for April 21st. And the deadline is tonight at 10. I'll submit it. And chances are good if they're going to accept, they'll do it quickly rather than, end of the year. It's a good trick if you need to get feedback quickly. Or if you have a book coming out and you need some more of the poems to appear in magazines before you finish the galleys, whatever.
Such a great tip. So practical.
Yeah. And the Poets and Writers website is great. The Poets and Writers website is fabulous. I would say always be cautious of publishers, even magazines that expect you to buy something to publish. You want to watch out for that, which I'm sure your listeners probably know. Want to be careful. Reading fees are sometimes very legit, and definitely for contests, for writing contests, the fees are legit. And I actually go for the more expensive ones. I will because I think less people submit and you have a better chance of getting published. So if there's a writing contest with a $35 fee and a $15 fee, I'll sometimes go for the $35. And of course, I definitely study the publication and make sure my work is fit. Always study the publication, always.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've heard that's the same in fiction as well, isn't it? Be sure that the publisher you're approaching publishes the type of story or the type of poetry, the subject matter that you're writing about.
I'll look up and see who they've published. And I often, if I have a particular writer I love, Allison Joseph is a U.S. writer here that I really like her work. And I looked and she was published by Finishing Line, so I approached them. So people I admire, work sometimes that mine is similar to, I'll look at who their publishers are or who has accepted their poems or their stories, and I'll approach that way. Mm-hmm. I don't do it blind. I do my research. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, my goodness, we're almost at time, but I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what you are. I'm not sure if you're still writing at the moment, because obviously you've had your manuscript accepted. So are you working on that, or are you working on something new?
I am. It's interesting you should ask that. Like I said, I try to pay attention to the critique of my work and see what people see in my work. And my sister sent me a book, Natalia Ginsburg, The Little Book of Virtues. And she was a Jewish writer in Europe during World War II, and these are essays. And she writes so beautifully about place. So I read some of her work about place, and I sat down and wrote quite a long essay about a store in my childhood. Just walking to the store with my brother, quarter in palm to go buy penny candy. So trying to get very specific and learning from what grabs me in other people's work. Mm-hmm. So I wrote that essay. It'll need some work. I'm quite a reviser. I am working on another book of poems. I'm about 30 poems in now to that. So yeah, I work on multiple things at a time.
Oh, lovely. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you very much, Kate. Just before we wrap up, could you tell listeners where they could find out more about you online?
Oh, look me up by name, Kate Cumiskey, Cumis as in Sam, Key. There are two of us. One is in Scotland. She's a soccer player. I don't play soccer. Just look me up and you can find some of my poems. Oh, let me turn that off. At Superstition Review, there's some poems I'm proud of. I have a WordPress blog that's educational mostly, but sometimes I share some writing. For instance, there's a chapter from a nonfiction book I'm working on there, and that's at Cumiskey Education Group. So I do sometimes share excerpts there as well. And of course, my forthcoming book, June 11th, from Finishing Line Press, is The Women Who Gave Up Their Vowels, and it's Bowels. And my novel, Anna, too.
Fantastic. Well, I shall be sure to link to all of those in the show notes. Now, for our listeners, if you're interested in hearing a little bit of Kate's work, you can pop on over to the Patreon page where you can, if you subscribe there, you can hear a little bit about some of Kate's work. And also she's generously offered us a writing prompt as well. So you can go to patreon.com/Emma Desi. But in the meantime, Kate, thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you. I have so enjoyed this conversation. I am going to get across the pond one of these days, and we'll have to have tea or something together over there.
Oh, I'd love that. That'd be really nice. Yes, let's make it happen.
And please have your listeners feel free to contact me and give feedback, or, I'm a teacher. If you need a prompt, send me an email at katecumiskey@gmail.com, and I'll send you a writing prompt.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found that helpful and inspirational. Now, don't forget to come on over to Facebook and join my group, Turning Readers into Writers. It is especially for you if you are a beginner writer who is looking to write their first novel. If you join the group, you will also find a free cheat sheet there called 3 Secret Hacks to Write with Consistency. So go to emmadesi.com/turning readers into writers, hit join. Can't wait to see you in there. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.